Somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, around 466 BC, a single Greek general stood at the bow of his trireme and looked out at the greatest Persian fleet to sail in a generation. 200 Phoenician warships, thousands of armoured infantry camped on the riverbank, an empire that had burned Athens to the ground, an empire that had whipped the sea and chained the Hellespont, an empire that believed it could still crush Greece forever. He didn't blink. His name was Cimon of Athens, son of Miltiades, the man who broke Persia at Marathon. And on this single, extraordinary day, at the mouth of a river called the Eurymedon in the wild coastline of Pamphylia, Cimon was about to do something that few commanders in the ancient world had ever done before, and very few would ever do again. He was going to destroy the entire Persian fleet at the mouth of the Eurymedon River, and then, before the sun touched the horizon, before his sailors could eat, before his marines could pull the arrows from their shields, before anyone had time to breathe, he was going to turn those same exhausted men around and charge straight into the Persian army on the beach. 2 battles in one day, a fleet destroyed, an army broken, and according to a later tradition, Cimon may have struck the Persian reinforcements before they even understood what had happened. The Persians never saw it coming. And by the time darkness fell on the Eurymedon River, the greatest military power on earth had been shattered, on the water and on the land, by a single Athenian general who refused to stop. This is the story of the Battle of the Eurymedon, and this is the brutal truth of what really happened that day. If you are new here, this channel is dedicated to the real unfiltered history of warfare, the strategy, the blood, the brilliant commanders, and the moments that changed the world. Hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a single battle. And if this story grips you in the next few minutes, smash that like button. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know. Now, let's get into it. To understand why the Battle of the Eurymedon was so extraordinary, you first need to understand the world it happened in. Because by 466 BC, Greece was not the quiet, philosophizing civilization that later centuries would romanticize. It was a violent, fractured, intensely competitive collection of city-states, each one ambitious, each one armed, and all of them still breathing in the smoke of 2 catastrophic Persian invasions. Go back just 14 years. In 480 BC, the Persian king Xerxes I had led the largest army the ancient world had ever assembled across the Hellespont and into Greece. He had overwhelmed the legendary 300 Spartans at Thermopylae. He had marched into Athens and burned it, the temples, the homes, the Acropolis, reduced to ash and rubble. To the Persians, Greece was not a civilization to be negotiated with. It was a problem to be exterminated. But Greece did not die. At the naval battle of Salamis in 480 BC, the Athenian-led fleet shattered Xerxes' navy in the narrow straits near Athens, and the following year, 479 BC, at the land battle of Plataea, the combined Greek armies destroyed the Persian land force and ended the invasion once and for all. Xerxes withdrew, humiliated. His dream of a Persian Greece died on those 2 battlefields. For the Greeks, these were the most important events in living memory, and for Athens in particular, they were something even more powerful than victories. They were a mandate. Athens had provided the ships that broke Persia at Salamis. Athens had built, organized, and led the naval response. And now, in the years following the Persian Wars, Athens moved decisively to convert that reputation into raw power. In 478 BC, Athens formed the Delian League. On the surface, it was an alliance of Greek city-states, drawn from the islands of the Aegean, from the coasts of Asia Minor, from cities that had suffered under Persian occupation, united for a single purpose: to carry the war to Persia, liberate Greek cities still under Persian control, and ensure that no invasion could ever threaten Greece again. The treasury of the League was kept on the sacred island of Delos. Every member contributed either ships or silver to the common cause. The arrangement seemed almost democratic, but Athens ran it. Athens set the agenda. Athens commanded the fleets, and the man Athens chose to lead those fleets, the man who would become the most feared Greek commander of his generation, was Cimon. Born around 510 BC, Cimon was the son of Miltiades, the Athenian general who had masterminded the Greek victory at Marathon in 490 BC. His father's legacy hung over him like a war standard, celebrated by some, resented by others. Cimon had first proven himself not in a council chamber but on a warship, fighting with conspicuous bravery at the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC. He rose fast, he fought hard, and in the years that followed, as Athens built its new imperial project, he became the most feared Greek commander of his generation. As the principal commander of the Delian League, Cimon spent the decade following Salamis methodically dismantling Persian power along the edges of the Aegean. He pressed the Persian Empire back from the sea it had once dominated, coast by coast, island by island. He was not content to defend Greece. He was determined to punish Persia, city by city, fleet by fleet, until the Persians understood that the Aegean was Greek water. But by 466 BC, something had changed. The Persian Empire had recovered enough of its will and enough of its pride to strike back. Xerxes I, still simmering over the humiliations of Salamis and Plataea, ordered the assembly of a massive new fleet and army on the southern coast of Asia Minor. The location was the mouth of the Eurymedon River in the region known as Pamphylia, and Cimon, receiving word of what was gathering there, made a decision that would define his legacy forever. He would not wait for the storm to come to him. He would sail directly into it, 200 Athenian triremes cutting east through hostile waters toward the largest Persian military force assembled since the invasion of Greece itself. What followed on the banks of the Eurymedon River was one of the most violent, most audacious and most consequential days in the entire history of ancient warfare. Picture Athens in the year 478 BC. Not the gleaming marble city of the history books. Not yet. The Acropolis is still a ruin. The temples that Xerxes burned in 480 BC are piles of blackened stone. The streets still carry the smell of ash. The greatest city in the Greek world had been sacked, gutted, and abandoned by its own citizens who fled by sea before the Persian advance. Athens had survived, but only barely, and the city that its people returned to was a ghost of what it had been. And yet, from that rubble, something extraordinary was beginning to grow. The Persian Wars had reshuffled the entire Greek world. Before Xerxes, before Marathon, before Thermopylae, it was Sparta that ruled the Greek imagination. Sparta had the finest infantry on earth. Sparta led the Peloponnesian League. When the Greek city-states united to resist Persia, it was a Spartan king, Leonidas, who became the symbol of that resistance by dying at Thermopylae. Sparta was the muscle. Sparta was the legend. But Sparta had a blind spot, the sea. And the sea was where the Persian Wars had actually been decided. It was Athens that had built the fleet of 200 triremes that broke Xerxes at Salamis in 480 BC. It was the Athenian general Themistocles who had conceived the strategy, who had manipulated the geography of the narrow straits to neutralize Persia's numerical advantage, and who had turned a desperate defensive fight into a crushing offensive victory. When the Battle of Salamis was over, Persia had lost its navy. Without a navy to supply and support his land army, Xerxes had no choice but to withdraw. And when the Persian land forces that remained were finally annihilated at Plataea in 479 BC, the invasion was finished. Greece had survived, and Athens had saved it. That fact, that Athens had provided the fleet, the strategy, and the decisive action, was not lost on the Greek world. Sparta could win battles on land, but it was Athens that had held the line at sea. And in the age that followed the Persian Wars, the age of the Aegean, the age of trade routes and island alliances and coastal cities, sea power was everything. Athens understood this perfectly. In 478 BC, just 1 year after Plataea, Athens moved with breathtaking speed to convert its wartime prestige into permanent political dominance. The Spartans, never comfortable with long naval campaigns, had already begun pulling back from the wider conflict. They had their own problems at home, helot populations to control, rival Greek states to watch. The island and coastal cities of the Aegean, many of which had only just been liberated from Persian control, needed protection, leadership, and a guarantor of their security. Athens stepped forward. On the sacred island of Delos, in the sanctuary of the god Apollo, delegates from across the Aegean world gathered to swear an oath and forge an alliance. City-states from the islands, from the coasts of Asia Minor, from the northern Aegean, they dropped ingots of iron into the sea as a symbol that the alliance would last until those iron lumps floated back to the surface, in other words, forever. The treasury would be kept on Delos. Every member would contribute either ships or silver to the common war fund. The goal, as Thucydides recorded it, was simple: to avenge the wrongs they had suffered by ravaging the territory of the Persian king. In practice, it meant something even more ambitious than revenge. It meant carrying the war to Persia. It meant liberating every Greek city still under Persian occupation. It meant making the Aegean Sea, every coastline, every island, every harbour, completely and permanently free of Persian power. The alliance was called the Delian League, and Athens led it. The man Athens chose to command its forces, the strategos who would become the sword arm of this new Athenian Empire, was Cimon. To understand Cimon, you have to understand his name. His father was Miltiades. That name meant something to every Greek alive in 478 BC. Miltiades was the man who had planned and executed the Greek victory at Marathon in 490 BC. The first time a Greek army had ever faced a full Persian invasion force in open battle and beaten it. Marathon had become a sacred word in Athens. It was the proof that Greeks could stand against the Persian Empire and win, and Miltiades was its architect. But Miltiades had died in disgrace. After Marathon, he had launched an ill-fated expedition against the island of Paros, failed, been wounded, and returned to Athens to face trial for deceiving the people. He was fined an enormous sum, 50 talents, which he could not pay. He was thrown in prison, and he died there in 489 BC, still owing the debt. His son Cimon, barely 20 years old, inherited everything. He inherited the debt. According to Plutarch, he even served part of his father's prison sentence in order to obtain the body for burial. He inherited the family's political enemies, and he inherited a reputation he had to either live up to or be crushed beneath. He was not crushed. Plutarch describes the young Cimon as rough around the edges, blunt in speech, hard drinking, more like a Spartan in his directness than a polished Athenian aristocrat. He was physically imposing, energetic, and utterly fearless. At the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC, he distinguished himself through conspicuous personal bravery. He was noticed. He was elected strategos, one of Athens' 10 annual generals, and the evidence strongly suggests he was re-elected to that role every single year through the 400s and 70s and into the 400s and 60s BC. He rose with astonishing speed to become the most powerful military figure in the Greek world. He was not a man who governed from a distance. He led from the front, on the deck of a trireme, with a weapon in his hand. His record in the early years of the Delian League tells you everything about how he operated. He did not wait for threats. He hunted them. In 476 BC, Cimon led a fleet to the Eurymedon River in Thrace, in the northern Aegean, where the city of Eion was still held by a Persian garrison under a commander named Boges. Cimon besieged the city. Boges, rather than surrender, burned his own stores, killed his own family, and threw his gold into the river before setting fire to the citadel and dying in the flames. The city fell. The Persian grip on the northern Aegean coast began to loosen. From Eion, Cimon moved to the island of Syros, which had become a base of operations for pirates preying on Athenian shipping. He drove them out. Then, in a masterstroke of symbolic politics, he claimed to have discovered the bones of the legendary Athenian hero Theseus on the island, and brought them back to Athens in a ceremonial procession. The city celebrated as if a god had come home. Cimon understood that war was theatre as much as it was violence, and he played both with equal skill. Other coastal cities in the northern Aegean fell into line one by one, submitting to the Delian League after watching what happened to those who resisted. The Persian presence was not just being checked, it was being systematically dismantled, pushed back, erased from waters it had once controlled. And it was not just military force that built Cimon's reputation. He spent his own personal wealth, the vast plunder he accumulated through campaign after campaign, on the city of Athens itself. He funded the expansion of the city's walls. He planted trees and built walkways on the plain of the academy. He allowed ordinary citizens to take fruit freely from his own estates. He was genuinely popular in a way that most powerful men in Athens were not not because he played the crowd, but because he shared what he had. But wealth and popularity were not what drove him. What drove Cimon was the conviction, deep, unshakable, almost personal, that Persia had to be beaten so thoroughly, so completely, that it would never again dare look westward toward Greece. His father had started that work at Marathon. He would finish it. By the mid-460 SBC, Cimon had cleared the northern Aegean of Persian power. He had liberated cities, built alliances, and turned the Delian League from a defensive pact into something far more aggressive, the foundation of an Athenian maritime empire. The League now numbered somewhere between 150 and 300 city-states, each contributing to the war chest that financed Athenian naval supremacy. But Persia was not dead. It was wounded, it was humiliated, and it was watching. And in the south, along the wild, rocky coastline of Pamphylia, in southern Asia Minor, something was stirring. Ships were being gathered, troops were being assembled. The Persian Empire, still vast, still rich beyond Greek imagination, was preparing to remind the world, and Athens in particular, that it was not finished. Cimon heard the reports. He assessed them with the cold clarity of a man who had spent his entire adult life at war. And he made his decision. He would not build defences, he would not wait. He would sail east directly into the heart of Persian power with every trireme he could muster, and he would force a confrontation on Persian terms and then win it anyway. The storm was coming, and Cimon was going to walk straight into it. The Persian Empire in the 460s BC was not a broken power. It was a wounded one, and wounded empires, vast, ancient, and proud, do not quietly accept their humiliation. They brood, they regroup, they plan, and eventually, when the memory of shame becomes unbearable, they strike back. Xerxes I was still on the throne, the same man who had built a bridge of boats across the Hellespont, the same man who had ordered 300 lashes of the sea itself as punishment for destroying his first bridge in a storm. The same man who had stood on a hilltop at Salamis and watched his navy collapse in the narrow straits below him, and wept. Xerxes had returned to Persia after his defeat in 479 BC a changed man. The ancient sources describe a king who had retreated into his palace at Persepolis, surrounded himself with his harem, and slowly withdrawn from the business of empire. He was there in body, but the energy, the ambition, the towering imperial will, it had gone out of him like a flame. But Cimon would not let him rest. As the 470s BC turned into the 460s, Cimon's campaigns in the Aegean had grown steadily bolder and more threatening to Persian prestige. He was not merely defending Greek waters. He was pushing into Persian-controlled territory, peeling cities and coastlines away from the empire one by one, building the Delian League into a power structure that stretched from the northern Aegean all the way down toward the coast of Asia Minor. Greek cities that had been under Persian authority for decades were declaring their autonomy, joining the League, paying tribute to Athens instead of Susa. The Persian Empire was not losing battles to Cimon, it was losing territory, losing revenue, losing the loyalty of coastal cities it had counted on for generations. And then Cimon crossed a line that Xerxes could not ignore. Cimon took 200 triremes, the full Delian League fleet, and sailed directly into Caria, the southwestern corner of Asia Minor Persian territory. He was not raiding. He was recruiting, liberating, and restructuring. He was helping Carian and Ionian Greek cities break free of Persian control and fold themselves into the Athenian alliance. This was not border skirmishing. This was the systematic dismantling of the Persian Empire's western edge, and Xerxes, whatever his personal deterioration, could no longer pretend it wasn't happening. He stirred himself. He issued orders. He opened the royal treasury. A massive Persian force began to assemble at Aspendos, near the mouth of the Eurymedon River, in the region of Pamphylia, the wild, rugged southern coast of Asia Minor. The Eurymedon was a significant river. Its mouth opened into a wide, sheltered estuary, perfect for anchoring a large fleet in protected waters, while an army camped on the banks. The Persians knew this coastline. They had used it before, and now they were pouring men and ships into it on a scale that had not been seen since the invasion of Greece itself. Later sources name Ariomandes as the overall Persian commander, Tithrustes as the fleet commander, whom Diodorus Siculus identifies as Xerxes' own son, though this detail is not confirmed by Thucydides, and Pherendatus as the commander of the land forces. Whatever the precise chain of command, this was no frontier patrol. It was a royal expedition funded by the full weight of the Persian imperial treasury. The fleet they assembled was staggering. Thucydides, the most conservative and reliable ancient source, puts the Persian fleet at 200 Phoenician triremes. Plutarch, drawing on other ancient historians now lost to us, gives numbers ranging from 350 to 600 ships. The truth is likely somewhere between these figures, but even the most cautious estimate, Thucydides' 200, means a fleet exactly matched in number to Cimon's own. And the Persians were still expecting 80 more Phoenician ships sailing in from Cyprus to join the force before any battle was fought. The Persian strategy was elegant in its logic, and it was one that a general as experienced as Cimon could immediately recognize and understand. Persia was fundamentally a land power. Its navy was not a free-ranging ocean force in the way Athens' navy was. The Persian fleet operated in close conjunction with its army, relying on coastal land bases for water, food, and supplies. You could not send a Persian fleet deep into enemy waters without also securing the coastline beneath it. That was the lesson of Salamis. A Persian navy cut off from reliable land support could be trapped and destroyed in confined waters. The plan at Eurymedon was therefore methodical and devastating in design. The fleet and army would move together up the southern coast of Asia Minor from west to east, capturing city after city, reclaiming each port as a naval base before moving on to the next. With each city taken, the Persian navy would have another resupply point, another secure harbour, and another step forward toward Ionia. Once the southern coast was fully under Persian control again, the fleet could move north into the Aegean and begin the real work, strangling the Delian League, recapturing the Greek islands, and eventually positioning Persia to threaten the Greek mainland for a third time. It was the kind of plan that, if executed properly and at full strength, was very nearly unstoppable, which is precisely why Cimon could not allow it to begin. Word reached Cimon at Cnidus, a Greek city on the western edge of Caria, where he had been operating with his 200 triremes. The reports described the scale of what was assembling at Aspendos. The ships, the troops, the Persian commanders. A lesser general would have pulled back. A defensive-minded commander would have consolidated his forces, reinforced the most important Ionian cities, and waited to see what the Persians actually did before committing to a response. That was the cautious move, the safe move. Cimon made the opposite decision. He would not wait for the Persians to begin their coastal march. He would not let them capture their first city and establish their first secure naval base. He would sail directly into their staging area and destroy them before they were ready, before their reinforcements arrived from Cyprus, before their fleet was fully organised, before their army and navy had fully integrated their operations. He would take the fight to the Persians on Persian ground, at a time of his own choosing, with every ship he had. He sailed east from Cnidus, hugging the coastline of Lycia and Pamphylia, heading directly toward the Eurymedon. But first, there was a problem. Between Cnidus and the Eurymedon lay the city of Phaselis, a Greek city, but one that had remained loyal to the Persian Empire. Its citizens were prosperous, comfortable, and had no desire to change allegiances or become a battleground between Athens and Persia. When Cimon's fleet of 200 triremes arrived off the coast of Phaselis and requested admission, the city refused. They shut their gates and watched from the walls. Cimon did not argue. He began ravaging the countryside around Phaselis. He was burning fields and threatening the city's survival when the Chian contingent of his fleet, the Chians being old friends and trade partners of Phaselis, stepped in as mediators. After negotiation, Phaselis agreed to join the Delian League. They would contribute soldiers to the expedition, and they would pay Cimon's forces 10 talents of silver as a sign of their commitment. The importance of capturing Phaselis was not merely tactical, it was strategic in the deepest sense. Phaselis was the easternmost Greek city in Asia Minor, sitting at the precise point where the southern coast of Asia Minor met the beginning of the Persian-controlled territories. It was the first city on the Persian list. By capturing it before the Persians could, Cimon had not just added a city to his alliance, he had blocked the entire Persian coastal strategy before it took a single step. Eurymedon's plan required Phalanx as its first base of operations. That base was now gone, and Cimon was still moving. From Phalanx he drove his fleet east, directly toward the mouth of the Eurymedon River, where 200 Phoenician warships rested at anchor, and a powerful Persian army waited on the bank, and where Tithraustes and Eurymedon and Pherendatus were still waiting for their 80 additional ships from Cyprus to arrive before beginning their campaign. They did not get to wait. They could already see the Greek sails on the horizon, 200 Athenian triremes low in the water, full of hardened marines and experienced oarsmen who had spent the better part of a decade at war, moving fast, moving without hesitation, moving straight toward them. The reinforcements from Cyprus would not arrive in time. The storm had come early, before we get to the battle itself, and trust me, what you're about to hear is absolutely worth the wait. I want to take 30 seconds to talk about something Cimon understood better than almost any commander of his age: intelligence, information, knowing what your enemy is doing before he knows what you're doing. Cimon sailed east from Cnidus because he had eyes and ears everywhere, informants, scouts, allied cities feeding him reports. He knew where the Persian fleet was. He knew it was not yet ready. He acted on that knowledge before the window closed. In today's world, your information is moving through the internet every single minute. You're browsing, your location, your private data, and most people have no idea who is watching it. NordVPN encrypts your internet connection and hides your digital activity from anyone trying to intercept it. Whether you are traveling, using public Wi-Fi, or just value your own privacy, NordVPN keeps you secure. Use the link in the description to get an exclusive deal, and protect your information the way Cimon protected his fleet, by making sure the enemy never sees you coming. Now, back to the Eurymedon, because the Persians are about to learn exactly what it means to be caught unprepared. The mouth of the Eurymedon River in the morning light would have been a sight unlike anything most of the men on either side had ever witnessed. The estuary was wide, sheltered by the curve of the coastline, and the water that time of year, late spring most historians believe, would have been flat and green, reflecting the bare rocky hills of Pamphylia. On the eastern bank the Persian army had made its camp. Tents, supply carts, horses, the cooking fires of thousands of men. The army of the Persian Empire camped on its own coastline watching the water, and on that water, riding at anchor in long, disciplined rows, the Phoenician fleet. 200 warships, the best sailors in the Persian Empire, the men who had given Persia its naval arm since the days of Darius, and coming from the west, sails full and oars already dipping in battle rhythm, 200 Athenian triremes. Cimon had driven his fleet hard from Phasalis. He was moving fast, deliberately fast, because every hour he delayed was an hour the 80 Phoenician reinforcements from Cyprus were using to close the distance. If those ships arrived before the battle began, the Persian fleet would outnumber his own by 80 warships. The moment for this attack was now, right now, and Cimon intended to use it with everything he had. The Persians saw them coming. Of course they did. 200 triremes at battle speed are not a subtle thing. The sound of 200 drumbeats setting rowing pace, the churning white water at 200 bronze rams cutting through the estuary toward you. There was no mistaking what was happening. Eurymedon and Tithraustes had a decision to make, and they had very little time to make it. They chose to avoid the fight. Plutarch tells us that the Persian fleet, eager to avoid engaging Cimon, retreated from the open mouth of the estuary into the river itself. This was a sound instinct. The Eurymedon River was narrower than the open estuary. In narrow waters, numbers count for less. The Persians had used this principle themselves at Artemisium, and Themistocles had weaponized it against them at Salamis. In the river, the Phoenician ships could form a tight line. Cimon could not bring his full force to bear at once. A fighting withdrawal was not necessarily a doomed strategy, but Cimon did not slow down. He continued to bear down on the Persian position with absolute unyielding aggression, and the Persian commanders, watching those Greek triremes come on and on with no sign of hesitation, made a fatal error. They accepted battle. We do not know exactly why. Perhaps Eurymedon judged that fighting in the river was better than having the Greek fleet block the mouth and trap the entire Persian fleet at anchor. Perhaps Tithraustes, commanding the fleet, felt the disgrace of pure flight too keenly. Perhaps the Persian sailors, who were Phoenicians, Professional mariners from Sidon and Tyre, proud and experienced, refused to simply run without a fight. For whatever reason, the order went out. The Phoenician fleet formed its line and came out to meet Cimon. It was the last decision the Persian fleet ever made as a fighting force. Now, to understand what happened next, you need to understand what an Athenian trireme actually was and what Cimon had done to it. A trireme was a long, narrow warship built around a single principle: speed. At the waterline on the bow, it mounted a massive bronze ram. The entire fighting doctrine of Athenian naval warfare in the classical period was built on the diekplous, threading through the enemy line at speed, snapping off oars as you passed, spinning, and ramming an exposed hull before the enemy could recover. It was a technique that required extraordinary seamanship, and a crew that had spent years together on the water. But Cimon had modified his ships. He had widened the decks. The Athenian trireme had originally been built deckless, or nearly so, to save weight and maximise speed. Cimon's triremes had broader fighting platforms. They carried more marines. According to Plutarch, each ship was loaded with additional hoplite soldiers, fully armoured infantrymen with shields, spears and short swords, specifically trained and equipped for boarding actions. Cimon was not just a sailor, he was a general, and he understood that the fastest way to destroy a Persian fleet was not just to ram it, but to board it, kill every man on the deck, and then burn it. The naval engagement itself was fast and one-sided in a way that shocked even the ancient historians. Thucydides, who is characteristically terse about military details, records only that the battle happened and that it ended in a Greek victory. Plutarch provides more colour. The Persian line was formed, the Phoenician ships in their battle order, oars out, ready to fight, and Cimon came at them with all 200 triremes in a coordinated attack. The Persian line broke almost immediately. This was not incompetence on the part of the Phoenician sailors. These were experienced men, fighting on behalf of the most powerful empire in the world. What broke them was a combination of factors that had been building for years. They were anchored in a river estuary, not on the open sea where their numbers might have made a difference. They had not finished assembling. Some ships were still improperly crewed, oarsmen still scrambling to their benches when the Greek ram hit. And perhaps most importantly, they were fighting men who had been at sea for months, who had trained for exactly this kind of aggressive assault, and who were led by a commander in Cimon who was operating at the absolute peak of his ability. The first Greek ships punched into the Persian line, and the result was catastrophic. Bronze rams found hull planking, oar banks shattered and splintered as Greek triremes threaded through the Phoenician formation. But it was what happened after the initial ramming that was most brutal. Cimon's marines, potentially thousands of armoured hoplites distributed across the fleet, were trained to bridge the gap between vessels the moment after impact and turn a naval engagement into a land fight on the water. Picture it. A Greek trireme drives its ram into the side of a Phoenician warship, locking the two vessels together. Before the Phoenician crew can push free, before the rowers can back water and escape, a boarding plank comes down or grappling hooks bite into the enemy rail. And then Greek hoplites, men in bronze helmets and bronze breastplates carrying metre-long shields and 8-foot spears, pour across the gap onto the enemy deck. A Phoenician sailor was a sailor. He carried a short sword or a knife. He wore no armour. He was trained to row and to navigate and to manoeuvre his ship with expert precision. He was not trained to stand and fight a fully armoured Greek infantryman at close quarters on a heaving deck. The result on ship after ship would have been slaughter, fast, brutal and utterly one-sided. Spears driving through unarmoured bodies, shields smashing men overboard into the river, the screaming of the wounded mixing with the crack of oars and the groan of stressed hull timbers. Ship after ship the pattern repeated itself. Persian warships disabled, boarded and cleared of life. The Eurymedon River, which had been a quiet estuary that morning, was now a charnel house of broken timber and dead men. What remained of the Persian fleet did the only thing it could do. It ran. The surviving Phoenician ships turned for the nearest shore and drove themselves onto the riverbank at full speed. The sailors abandoned their vessels and ran for the Persian army camp, seeking the protection of the soldiers watching from the beach. Some ships were captured before they could reach the bank. Others were driven aground so hard that the rams split the bow timbers. Some may have been sunk during the actual engagement, but the vast majority, The full 200 Phoenician warships that Thucydides records were run aground, abandoned, and left to the Greeks. The Persian naval force had ceased to exist as a fighting formation in what was probably a matter of hours, perhaps less. Cimon brought his fleet to shore. His sailors and marines were soaked in blood and seawater. They had been at the oars since dawn. They had fought and killed and watched their own men die on heaving decks a few feet above the river surface. They were exhausted in the way that only men who have survived close-quarters combat can be exhausted, not just physically, but in the deep cellular sense, the whole body ringing with the aftermath of mortal terror and mortal violence. Any normal commander would have called it a victory. Any rational general would have landed his men, set guards over the captured Persian ships, eaten, drunk, rested, and sent a messenger back to Athens with news of the greatest naval triumph since Salamis. Cimon looked at the Persian army on the beach, thousands of men still in their ranks, thousands of enemy soldiers who had watched the fleet die and were now standing there, disordered, horrified, leaderless in spirit if not in name, but still armed, still numerous, still capable of being a threat to every Greek city on the coast of Asia Minor. He made his decision. The day was not over. There is a moment in every battle, every real battle, the kind that ancient historians describe not with glory, but with unflinching honesty, where the human body reaches its absolute limit, where the legs stop working on command, where the arms, which have been swinging and blocking and thrusting for hours, begin to shake not from fear but from pure physical depletion, where the eyes that have been tracking movement, judging distance, calculating threats, start to slow, where the mind, which has been running at a speed that ordinary life never demands, begins to stutter. Cimon's men had reached that moment. They had been at the oars since before dawn. They had rowed across miles of open water at battle pace, a physical effort so punishing that Greek triremes carried 3 banks of oarsmen, around 170 rowers per ship, because their speed depended on a massive, perfectly coordinated human engine. They had then fought a full naval battle, a close-quarters, ship-to-ship engagement involving boarding actions, hand-to-hand combat on pitching decks, the constant physical shock of bronze rams striking wood, grappling hooks, men falling into the water, men being killed on both sides. They had grounded their ships, they had climbed ashore, and now, with Persian blood still drying on their armour and river water in their boots, they stood on the beach at the mouth of the Eurymedon and looked at what was in front of them. The Persian land army, thousands of men, still in formation, still armed, still very much alive. According to the foundation for the Hellenic world's scholarly encyclopedia of Asia Minor history, Cimon himself looked at that army and paused. He was not afraid. Cimon did not do afraid, but he was a rational man, and rational men count. His forces were exhausted. The Persian land troops had not fought that day. They had watched. They were rested, fed, and standing on ground of their own choosing, ground they had prepared as a military camp. Their numbers were substantial. The army that accompanied 200 Phoenician warships was not a token escort. And Cimon's marines, however skilled, were already spent. He genuinely considered waiting. He considered regrouping, resting his men through the night, and attacking at dawn when his forces had recovered something of their strength. This would have been the professionally defensible decision. It is what most commanders in the ancient world would have done. A victory at sea was already an extraordinary achievement. The destruction of the Persian fleet was the most important Greek military accomplishment in a generation. No reasonable council of war would have faulted Cimon for calling the day done and consolidating his position. But then he looked at his men, and what he saw was not the broken, staggering faces of men who had given everything they had. He saw the opposite. He saw men standing on the shore, still gripping their weapons, their chests heaving, their eyes fixed on the Persian camp with an expression that every general who has ever commanded soldiers in victory knows immediately. He saw men who were not depleted but electrified, men who had just torn apart the greatest naval force Persia had assembled in a generation, and could still feel it in their blood. That specific, irrational, terrifying energy that combat victory produces in soldiers, the sensation that they were, in this moment, physically and spiritually invincible. The soldiers themselves were demanding the order to advance. Plutarch records it plainly. Cimon saw that his men, full of pride and vigorous from their victory, were eager to engage the Persians hand to hand, and so, discarding the rational calculation, trusting the instincts of men who knew their own readiness better than any general could measure it from a distance, he gave the order. The hoplites formed their phalanx on the beach. To understand what this meant physically, you need to understand the Greek hoplite and what he was carrying. A full hoplite in the classical Greek military tradition was not a lightly equipped skirmisher. He wore a bronze helmet that covered everything but his eyes and mouth, a bronze breastplate or thick linen corselet moulded to the torso, bronze greaves protecting his lower legs, and bronze or leather arm guards. He carried an aspers, a large round bronze-faced shield approximately 90 centimetres in diameter, weighing around 7 kilograms, strapped not to his hand but to his forearm so that it could not be dropped or pulled away. He carried a dory, a thrusting spear approximately 2.5 meters long, in his right hand, and at his hip a short iron sword, the xiphos, for close quarters fighting when the spear was broken or the formations collapsed into a melee. The total weight of a hoplite's full panoply was somewhere between 15 and 30 kilograms. These men had been wearing this equipment through a naval battle. Some of them had been in hand-to-hand combat on the decks of their ships. All of them had been rowing or fighting or doing both since the early morning, and now they were preparing to form a phalanx, a dense, disciplined wall of overlapping shields, and advance across open beach into a superior Persian force. The phalanx was the defining tactical formation of Greek land warfare. It worked on a principle of devastating collective strength. Each man locked his shield into the shield of the man to his left, forming a continuous wall of bronze across the entire front of the formation. The spears of the first 3 ranks projected past the shield wall, creating a hedge of iron points that was almost impossible to break from the front. The men in the rear ranks pressed forward, adding their weight and momentum to the push of the front rank. When a phalanx struck an infantry formation that was not itself phalanx trained, the result was often instantaneous and catastrophic. The impact of a moving wall of armoured men, hundreds wide and several ranks deep, striking at full march pace, was unlike anything in ancient warfare. The Persian infantry were not phalanx warriors. The backbone of Persian land forces was the Immortals and the various infantry levies drawn from across the empire: Medes, Bactrians, Lydians, Egyptians, each fighting in their own traditional manner. Persian soldiers were often equipped with wicker shields, light armour, short spears, and bows. They were skilled and experienced fighters. They had their own courage. But they fought as individuals or in loose formations, not as a locked, coordinated wall of bronze. When the Greek phalanx hit them, the physics were brutal. The initial Persian line held. This is important to note, and the ancient sources do not shy from it. Cimon's assault on the Persian camp was not a walkover. The Persians resisted, and they resisted hard. Prominent Athenians died in this fighting. The sources mention specifically that men of high rank and reputation fell in the land battle. The combat was close, punishing, and deadly on both sides. The Persian soldiers who had watched their fleet destroyed were not broken men begging for mercy. They were soldiers of the greatest empire on earth, and they fought to defend their position. But exhaustion has its own momentum, and so does terror. The sailors from the Persian fleet, thousands of men who had just escaped the naval slaughter, had joined the land force. But they were not soldiers, they were mariners, frightened and disorganized, and their presence in the camp created exactly the kind of confusion and crowding that makes a defensive line difficult to hold. As Cimon pressed the assault and the phalanx continued to hammer at the Persian formation, the structure of the defence began to fracture at the edges. The Persian line broke. It did not bend, it broke. The Persian soldiers ran, and when an ancient army runs, it does not run in an organised fighting retreat. It runs as individuals, every man for himself, throwing away shields and spears that slow him down, streaming in every direction away from the line that has just collapsed. And the Greeks, the same men who had been told they were too exhausted to fight, pursued them. They pursued them inland, deep into the Persian camp, and captured everything. The tents of the army, the supplies, food, water, wine, oil, the war chest, the silver and gold that financed the expedition, the equipment, the horses. According to the account preserved in the Encyclopedia of the Greek World, the Persian command structure had been shattered, and later tradition claimed that Pherendatus himself was killed in the fighting. But the day was not finished. Not yet. Because Cimon still had one more hand to play. Remember the 80 Phoenician ships from Cyprus, the reinforcements that Ariomandes had been waiting for when Cimon's arrival had made the battle begin, prematurely. Those ships had not been at the Battle of the Eurymedon. They had been sailing along the coastline of Asia Minor, closing toward the Eurymedon as planned, completely unaware of what had happened that day. Their entire fleet was gone. Their army was broken. The greatest Persian military expedition in a generation had been reduced to wreckage and corpses in the space of a single afternoon. But the Cyprian ships did not know this. What happened next to the 80 Phoenician reinforcements from Cyprus is where our ancient sources diverge. Plutarch tells us that Cimon, upon learning the Cyprian ships had put in at a nearby anchorage, moved against them swiftly before they could learn of the disaster, and that this action too ended in a Greek victory. The Cyprian fleet, sailing toward what they believed was a live Persian staging area, had no idea the army was destroyed and the fleet gone. Cimon exploited that ignorance completely. Diodorus Siculus preserves a more elaborate and highly dramatic tradition involving captured Persian ships, Persian clothing, and a night attack. But in Diodorus, that stratagem is attached to the assault on the Persian land camp at the Eurymedon, not to the 80 Phoenician reinforcements from Cyprus. The Loeb editor explicitly warns that Diodorus is badly confused in this section, and that Plutarch's simpler account is the safer and more reliable version. What can be stated with confidence is this: the Cyprian reinforcements did not escape. Whether by swift interception, surprise, or panic, they were caught. The ships were captured or destroyed. Their crews were killed or taken prisoner. The last Persian naval force in the theatre had been eliminated. 2 battles in one day, one on water, one on land, and according to Plutarch, Cimon then moved with astonishing speed against the 80 Phoenician reinforcements before they fully understood what had happened, striking before the news of the disaster could reach them. The scope of Persian losses that day was staggering. Ancient sources give varying figures, as they always do, and the exact numbers cannot be confirmed with certainty. But Diodorus Siculus gives the enormous figures of 340 ships captured and more than 20,000 Persians killed or taken prisoner in the combined fighting. Modern historians treat those numbers with caution. Diodorus' Eurymedon narrative has known reliability problems, but the strategic reality was undeniable. The Persian fleet in the eastern Mediterranean had been destroyed. The army that accompanied it had been destroyed. The reinforcement fleet from Cyprus had been destroyed. The Persian command structure had been broken. Ariomandes had lost everything. Cimon's men stood on the beach at the mouth of the Eurymedon River, bloody, exhausted beyond rational calculation, surrounded by burning Persian ships and the wreckage of the Persian camp, and they had nothing left to do but count what they had taken. The plunder was enormous: silver, gold, weapons, equipment. The accumulated wealth of a royal Persian military expedition, all of it now in Athenian hands. Plutarch records that the booty taken from Eurymedon was so vast that it helped finance the construction projects that would eventually transform the Acropolis of Athens into the gleaming architectural wonder the modern world still visits. The walls, foundations, and public works that helped prepare Athens for its classical golden age were partly paid for with the spoils that Cimon dragged off the beach at the Eurymedon. The greatest double military victory in a single day that the ancient Greek world had ever seen had come to an end. And somewhere in his palace at Persepolis, Xerxes I, the king who had whipped the sea and burned Athens, received word of what had happened at the Eurymedon River. The accounts in ancient sources describe the impact of this news on the Persian court as devastating. Diodorus Siculus, writing centuries later, even claimed that the catastrophe of Eurymedon was connected to the conspiracy that led to Xerxes' murder in 465 BC, just a year after the battle. The timeline makes this claim impossible to verify, but the symbolic weight of it reveals how the ancient world remembered the event. Eurymedon was not just a battle. It was a wound to the empire so deep that it reached all the way to the throne. Xerxes' son, Artaxerxes I, who became king after his fathers, assassination in 465 BC drew the appropriate lesson. He never again attempted to assemble a direct military force to reconquer the Aegean coast or invade Greece from the sea. Instead, for the rest of his reign, he pursued a different strategy, funding Greek internal conflicts, playing Athens against Sparta, pouring Persian gold into the political fractures of the Greek world, trying to destroy from within what he could not destroy from without. The Persian Wars against Greece would eventually be resolved not on a battlefield, but in a negotiating chamber, in the so-called Peace of Callias, sometime around 449 BC. The existence, date, and exact terms of the Peace of Callias are still debated by historians, but later Greek tradition remembered the post-Eurymedon world as one in which Persian naval pressure on the Aegean had been sharply reduced, a world shaped in no small part by what Cimon had done at the Eurymedon River. Cimon helped create the conditions that made such a diplomatic settlement imaginable. At the Eurymedon, he had demonstrated so comprehensively and so brutally that direct military confrontation with Athens at sea and on land was not a viable option for the Persian Empire, that Persia stopped attempting that kind of direct, large-scale naval confrontation in the Aegean. One general, one day, two battles, and the entire strategic balance of the ancient Mediterranean world shifted forever. Cimon lived for another 15 years after the Eurymedon, but his story, like so many great commanders, ended not in triumph, but in the grinding complexity of politics and fate. His power in Athens rested on his military success and on his political alliance with Sparta. He had always believed that Athens and Sparta should cooperate rather than compete, and he pursued that policy with the same blunt conviction with which he pursued everything. But Athens was changing. The democratic reforms of Ephialtes and the young Pericles were transforming the city's political structure, stripping power from the aristocratic council of the Areopagus that Cimon had relied on. His political enemies grew stronger, and in 462 BC, after an embarrassing episode in which he had led Athenian troops to assist Sparta during the Great Helot Revolt and was dismissed by the Spartans, who distrusted Athenian intentions, Cimon's enemies struck. He was ostracized in 461 BC, exiled from Athens for 10 years by popular vote. He spent his exile watching from a distance as Athens and Sparta stumbled toward open conflict, and as the Delian League, the alliance he had built and led and bled for, began to transform under Pericles into something closer to an Athenian imperial project, with tribute collected by force, with allied cities kept in line by Athenian garrisons, with the treasury moved from Delos to Athens itself. The idealistic anti-Persian alliance was becoming an empire. Cimon had made it possible, and history moved on without him. He was recalled from ostracism before his 10 years were complete, reportedly negotiating a brief truce between Athens and Sparta before withdrawing from Athenian politics. And then, in 450 BC, he was given one final command. Athens was at war in Cyprus, trying to reassert Delian League influence against Persia in the eastern Mediterranean. Cimon led the fleet. He was old by the standards of his age, nearly 60 years old, but the reports describe him as vigorous and determined, planning a wide operation across Cyprus and Egypt. He died at the siege of Citium on Cyprus around 450 BC. Some ancient sources say he died of illness. Others suggest wounds. The details are lost. What is not lost is what he left behind. The Battle of the Eurymedon stands 24 centuries later as one of the most audacious and complete military victories in recorded history. 200 Persian warships destroyed, an entire land army defeated, reinforcements intercepted before they could recover or understand the disaster. The core victory accomplished in a single day by a commander who did not know the word retreat. Cimon was not the most celebrated general of the ancient world. He does not have the name recognition of Alexander or Caesar or Hannibal. He was too blunt, too direct, too honest for the political climate that eventually destroyed him. He did not write his own history. He did not build his own mythology. He just won, over and over and over again. And on one day in particular, at the mouth of a river in Pamphylia called the Eurymedon, he won so completely and so savagely that the greatest empire on earth quietly decided it would never fight him again. That is the brutal truth of the Battle of the Eurymedon, and that is the legacy of Cimon of Athens, If you made it to the end of this video, you're exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. Drop a comment below telling me what surprised you most about Cimon and the Eurymedon. I read every single one. If this story hit the way I think it did, share it with someone who loves history. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to a channel like this. Subscribe if you haven't yet, and check the playlist on screen right now for more battles, more commanders, and more brutal truths from the history of warfare. I'll see you in the next one.